with the success of Artemis 2 now behind them. NASA is carrying major momentum into the next stage of its mission to return humans to the moon. But that naturally raises an important question for many people. What happens next? The answer is not simple, because the next phase involves one of the biggest rivalries ever seen between two giants of American aerospace. Artemis 3 is expected to push NASA to the edge of its capabilities, especially at a time when its position as the world's leading space agency is no longer fully secure and global competition is accelerating rapidly. As a result, an enormous amount of work must be completed within a very limited time frame. Shortly after Artemis 2 concluded, NASA immediately started evaluating condition of its mobile launch tower. The structure had already been reinforced and upgraded after suffering major damage during Artemis 1, with the goal of significantly reducing the preparation time between SLS rocket launches. Nearly all of the essential hardware for Artemis 3 has already been completed, including the booster engines, the upper stage, and the Orion spacecraft. At this point, the focus is mainly on assembling everything together, and NASA is moving forward without delay. However, this next chapter introduces an additional challenge that is not entirely within NASA's control. To complete Artemis 3, NASA needs more than the SLS rocket and the Orion capsule. They also need a lunar landing system, and that is where the situation becomes much more interesting. Back in 2021, SpaceX received a NASA contract to transform its Starship upper stage vehicle into the human landing system for Artemis 3. It is important to remember how early the project still was at that time. Starship looked very different then. It was an early prototype capable of launching only a few kilometers into the air before falling back down in an attempt to land safely. Most of those early tests ended in explosions, but after finally achieving a successful landing, SpaceX advanced to the next phase with Starship Super Heavy, a much larger and more refined prototype system. Over the last 3 years, we have watched several new versions complete different test missions. These launches sent the upper stage into suborbital flight paths, often ending either with the vehicle breaking apart during re-entry or successfully splashing down in the Indian Ocean. Overall, failures have still outnumbered successful recoveries, but the progress has been impossible to ignore. With each launch, Starship moves one step closer to becoming a fully operational rocket system. Still, there is an important issue. Although the development of Starship has been remarkable and unlike anything attempted before, progress toward turning it into a dependable spacecraft capable of landing safely on the moon has taken longer than Elon Musk originally predicted. Looking back, that delay was probably expected, since overly ambitious timelines have become a familiar pattern. Because of this uncertainty, NASA decided to expand its options. In May 2023, only days after the first Starship Super Heavy launch lost control and exploded before reaching space, NASA awarded a second lunar landing contract. This time, the contract went to Blue Origin, the aerospace company founded by Jeff Bezos, which at the time was mostly known for sending wealthy passengers to the edge of space. But like SpaceX, Blue Origin had much larger goals. The company was developing its own heavy-lift rocket, called New Glenn, along with a lunar lander known as Blue Moon. Space has always captured human imagination, from the earliest rockets leaving Earth to detailed images of distant worlds and the missions that continue pushing the limits of exploration. That sense of wonder has remained constant, and it does not have to end when the video is over. That is where Displate comes in. Displate produces premium quality metal posters designed around the things people are passionate about, whether that involves space exploration, science, or humanity's future among the stars. The prints are made using durable steel, allowing the artwork to remain sharp, colorful, and detailed for many years. With more than 2 million available designs, including officially licensed collections and original artwork from creators across the globe, there is an enormous variety to choose from. If you want something more personal, you can even upload your own image and turn it into a custom metal poster. One of the best features is how simple the setup process is. There is no drilling, no complicated tools, and no damage to your walls. The magnetic mounting system only takes a few seconds, and designs can easily be swapped whenever you want. It is a clean and simple way to bring the feeling of exploration and creativity into your personal space. If you would like to explore their collection, use the link in the description below. The discount will apply automatically, or you can enter my code during checkout. You can receive 26% off one disc plate, 31% off two, and 36% off three or more. It is a great way to start building your own space-inspired environment, one piece at a time. This is the point where the competition truly becomes a battle between industry giants. In January 2025, Blue Origin effectively closed the gap with SpaceX by launching New Glenn for the first time. The mission was largely successful, although the returning booster ultimately exploded while descending back to Earth. Then, in November 2025, Blue Origin conducted a second New Glenn launch, and this time the mission performed exactly as planned. The upper stage successfully deployed 2 satellites onto a trajectory toward Mars, while the booster completed a controlled landing on a floating recovery platform. Based on the current state of this competition between the two companies, NASA has decided that Artemis 3 could potentially include testing for one or even both lunar lander systems. Everything depends on which company is able to stay on schedule and deliver a working vehicle in time. And right now, that target year is 2027. So, what exactly does that mission look like? Artemis 3 will begin in a very similar way to what we witnessed on April 1st, with a fresh crew of 4 astronauts sitting inside their capsule on top of a massive orange rocket. However, this time their immediate destination will not be the moon. That does not mean NASA is any less focused on landing astronauts on the lunar surface. In fact, the urgency is greater now than it has ever been before. What has changed is the strategy. The roadmap to a moon landing has become more detailed, more realistic, and far more carefully planned. Originally, the idea was to move directly from Artemis 2, which successfully flew around the moon and returned home, straight into a full lunar landing mission with Artemis 3. As for how the actual landing systems would operate in practice, the expectation was essentially to figure things out during the mission itself and trust that everything would work once they arrived. Naturally, that approach did not inspire much confidence, especially when astronauts' lives are involved. Because of that, NASA adjusted the plan. The updated Artemis 3 mission now includes testing a potential lunar lander much closer to Earth, where help and recovery options are far more accessible if something goes wrong. This means that alongside the launch of the SLS rocket and Orion spacecraft, there will also be 1 or possibly 2 additional heavy rocket launches taking place. For the sake of this example, let's assume both lunar lander candidates are ready in time because it allows us to explore how both mission scenarios would work. The first vehicles to launch will be the moon landers themselves. That means 1 Starship vehicle from SpaceX and 1 Blue Moon lander launched by New Glenn. Both systems will first place their lander stages into low Earth orbit. This is where the next major challenge begins. Lunar Starship and Blue Moon are extremely large spacecraft, and moving such heavy vehicles from Earth orbit all the way to the moon requires an enormous amount of fuel. Simply getting there consumes a huge portion of their propellant. Before either spacecraft can safely attempt a lunar landing, they must first refuel in orbit. Without additional fuel, they would not have enough power to lift astronauts back off the moon and return them safely to orbit. As part of Artemis 3, both SpaceX and Blue Origin must prove they can complete orbital refueling successfully. For SpaceX, this involves launching another Starship configured as a fuel tanker. For Blue Origin, the process requires a separate propellant transfer vehicle. That means 2 additional major rocket launches, followed by orbital docking operations and fuel transfer demonstrations for both Lunar Starship and Blue Moon. It may sound routine, but orbital refueling has never been accomplished before in human spaceflight. Successfully performing 2 separate refueling operations would represent a major technological milestone. Once those demonstrations are complete, attention turns to the launch of the SLS rocket. This part of the mission will unfold similarly to Artemis 2, but with one major difference. After Orion reaches space, it will not continue directly toward the moon. Instead, the spacecraft will maneuver to rendezvous with the first lunar lander waiting in Earth orbit. The first major task will be docking the 2 vehicles together. The lander itself will operate autonomously, while Orion will have a pilot manually overseeing the docking process. This is actually something NASA already practiced during Artemis 2. During a mock docking exercise, pilot Victor Glover guided the Orion capsule toward its own spent upper stage engine to simulate the procedure. In the first scenario, Orion approaches Blue Moon from the side and docks with a port located near the crew compartment at the lower section of the lander. Most of the upper structure is dedicated to fuel storage, while the astronauts transfer directly into the habitation area. Although the interior is not especially large, comparing Blue Moon to the original Apollo lunar module clearly shows that astronauts will have significantly more room to work and move around. The second scenario is noticeably different. Lunar Starship places its docking port at the nose of the spacecraft. Once the crew transfers through the hatch, they enter a massive open flight deck measuring roughly 9 meters wide and several meters tall. Compared to previous lunar landers, the amount of interior space is remarkably large. In either situation, once the astronauts are inside, the focus immediately shifts to system testing and operational checks. The crew will carefully examine life support systems, electrical power, propulsion controls, and communication equipment. They will likely separate the landers from Orion, perform manual maneuvering exercises in orbit, and then reconnect with the capsule again. The goal is to identify weaknesses, technical problems, or design improvements that can be addressed before the next version of the lander is used for an actual moon landing mission. It is important to remember that the original Artemis 3 plan expected astronauts to enter these spacecraft for the very first time, while already orbiting the moon. That would have been a dangerous situation if any critical system failed unexpectedly. This updated testing approach gives NASA an opportunity to solve problems much closer to Earth before committing to a lunar descent mission. During these orbital tests, the astronauts will also wear and evaluate their lunar spacesuits in microgravity for the first time. These new lunar suits are being developed by Axiom Space, and they represent a completely new generation of spacesuit technology. They are very different from the suits currently used by NASA astronauts aboard the International Space Station, and they also differ significantly from the bulky suits worn during the Apollo moon missions decades ago. The goal of these new designs is to give future moon explorers far greater mobility and flexibility, while reducing the stiff and awkward movement that older suits were known for. So far, these suits have already gone through underwater testing here on Earth, which helps simulate certain conditions astronauts experience in space. However, the real challenge will come when astronauts step into the airlock of the lunar lander and expose the suits directly to the vacuum of space for the very first time. NASA expects all of these testing activities and system evaluations to take roughly 3 weeks for the crew to complete. That means there will be a great deal to follow and analyze once Artemis 3 officially begins. But while preparations for Artemis 3 continue, there's already plenty happening back on Earth as well. In May 2026, SpaceX plans to conduct the first test flight of Starship version 3 from its newly built launch infrastructure at Starbase, Texas. According to the company, this is expected to become the first true production-ready Starship, rather than another experimental prototype. In other words, this is a version they believe could eventually carry astronauts to the moon. Of course, additional work still needs to be completed. The spacecraft will require fully developed interior sections, crew accommodations, and advanced life support systems before it can safely support human passengers. But SpaceX believes it still has enough time to complete those upgrades before the planned missions begin. Meanwhile, over at Blue Origin, another major milestone is also scheduled for May. The company is preparing for the first test flight of the Blue Moon Mark 1 prototype. This version is smaller than the full human-rated Blue Moon lander and is designed primarily for delivering medium-sized cargo loads to the lunar surface rather than transporting astronauts. The purpose of this first mission is straightforward but extremely important: travel all the way to the moon and achieve a safe landing. If Blue Origin succeeds, it would generate a significant amount of confidence within NASA and throughout the aerospace industry. More importantly, it would shift Blue Origin's reputation from being a company that arrived late to the race into becoming a legitimate competitor in lunar exploration. So, assuming both companies successfully complete these milestones and Artemis 3 ends with both landers being tested safely in Earth orbit, the next major objective becomes another historic step forward: an autonomous, uncrewed lunar landing mission. You can think of this phase almost like an unofficial Artemis 3.5 mission. Once NASA confirms that astronauts can safely live and operate inside these spacecraft, The next requirement is proving that the vehicles can actually land on the moon successfully without a crew on board. Only after completing that demonstration can one company truly claim victory in this competition. Even then, there'll be little time to slow down because NASA intends to launch Artemis 4 within roughly 1 year of Artemis 3. That means either SpaceX or Blue Origin will need to manufacture these lunar landers at an extremely rapid pace in order to keep up with the schedule. This is the broader reason America is returning to the moon. The goal is not simply to place another flag on the lunar surface or celebrate a symbolic achievement. The larger objective is establishing a long-term and dominant presence within the lunar environment, especially as other major global powers continue accelerating their own plans. One of the biggest competitors is China, which is also developing its own strategy for building a future moon base. And based on current developments, China is approaching this challenge very seriously as well.